The year was 1904. The place was Harmony Creek, a small and isolated township carved out of the dense, unforgiving woods of rural Maine. The object was a simple parish ledger from the St. James Chapel, its leather cover softened and cracked by time and humidity. On a page dated for the late autumn of that year, among the usual recorded donations of firewood for the coming winter and sacks of flour for the poor, a single entry stood apart. It noted the anonymous gift of 12 woolen coats, all of them impeccably made, all of them identical in their dark gray color, and all of them sized for children of approximately 10 years of age. This was the aberration, the quiet detail that did not belong. Because the official town records, the meticulously kept books of births and deaths and new arrivals, stated with cold certainty that not a single child had been born in, or moved to, Harmony Creek for nearly a decade. If the forgotten voices of history call to you, and this is your first time here, consider subscribing to join our circle of archivists and keep the past within reach. The arrival of Mr. Silas Lamont and his wife, Mrs. Alara Lamont, had been a quiet affair, as most things were in Harmony Creek. They purchased the old McGregor farm on the edge of town, a sprawling and somewhat neglected property bordered by a thick forest on one side and the town's silent, unkempt cemetery on the other. Mr. Lamont was a retired merchant from a distant city, a man whose hands were soft and whose posture was always straight. He carried a silver pocket watch that he polished with a slow, circular motion whenever he was made to wait. Mrs. Lamont was a former seamstress, a woman with a gentle face and a fondness for the wild bluebells that grew along the property line. They were, by all accounts, a respectable and welcome addition to the small community, their wealth apparent but never displayed. For the first several months, they kept to themselves, working on the farm, repairing the fences, and replanting the fallow gardens. The town watched them with a placid curiosity, the kind reserved for any newcomers who chose to settle in a place most people were trying to leave. The quiet admiration for their diligence was palpable. Then came the first Sunday of October. The church bell of St. James Chapel rang out across the valley, its familiar bronze tone calling the faithful to worship. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. As the parishioners filed into the wooden pews, a new sound joined the gentle shuffling of feet and the rustle of Sunday coats. It was the sound of many small shoes, walking in a slow, measured cadence up the stone steps of the chapel. The heavy oak doors swung open, and Mr. and Mrs. Lamont entered. They were not alone. Behind them, in two perfectly straight lines of 6, walked 12 children. The congregation fell silent, every head turned. The children were all of a similar height and build, their faces pale and serious, their hair a uniform shade of dark brown, cut short and neat for the boys, tied back with simple black ribbons for the girls. They wore the same dark gray woolen coats that had been noted in the parish ledger weeks earlier. Mr. and Mrs. Lamont guided them to the front pew, their expressions serene, offering quiet nods to their neighbors. The children did not look around. Their eyes were fixed forward, their hands clasped behind their backs. They sat without fidgeting, without whispering, without a single sound passing between them for the entire duration of the service. They were a perfect, silent tableau of youthful solemnity. The townspeople were astounded. They had known the Lamonts were generous, contributing to the church and the town fund, but no one had imagined this. To adopt a single child was a significant act of charity. To adopt 12 was an act of profound, almost unbelievable sainthood. Whispers followed the family as they left the church that day. The women spoke of Mrs. Lamont's quiet strength, her beatific smile. The men remarked on Mr. Lamont's dignified bearing, the clear pride he took in his large, unusual family. They were a marvel, a living testament to Christian charity in a hard and often unforgiving world. Yet, as the weeks turned into a month, the initial admiration began to curdle into a quiet, unspoken unease. The whispers changed in tone. It was noted, over fences and at the general store, that the children's pale features were not just similar, they were nearly identical. It was more than a family resemblance. It was the sameness of dolls cast from a single mold. Their eyes, a deep and unblinking shade of gray, seemed to hold no childish light. They moved with a synchronized grace that was unsettling, turning their heads in unison to watch a passing buggy, or pausing all at once as if listening to a sound no one else could hear. They never played in the boisterous, chaotic way of other children. Their games were silent, orderly affairs in the front yard of the farm, their movements precise and repetitive. They were a perfect, unnerving chorus, and their silence was heavier than any noise. The idyllic surface of the Lamont family began to show fine, hairline cracks, and a deep sense of wrongness started to seep through. The town of Harmony Creek continued to admire the Lamont's generosity, but they began to fear their children. The first official crack in the facade appeared with the arrival of the new school teacher, Miss Evelyn Reed. She was a young woman from a more populated part of the state, full of modern ideas and a genuine desire to educate the children of this remote community. Her schoolhouse was small and smelled of chalk dust and old wood, but it was her domain, and she ran it with a gentle but firm hand. She believed every child deserved a place within its walls. After seeing the Lamont children sitting quietly in their yard week after week, she decided it was her duty to approach the family. She walked the long, dusty road to the old McGregor farm one afternoon, a bundle of enrollment papers tucked under her arm. The air grew cooler as she approached the property, the trees seeming to press in on the road, silencing the bird song. Mrs. Alara Lamont greeted her at the door with that same placid smile. She invited the teacher into the parlor, a room that was impeccably clean but strangely impersonal. There were no scattered toys, no smudged fingerprints on the walls, no signs of the vibrant chaos that 12 children should have produced. Mrs. Lamont listened patiently as Miss Reed explained the importance of formal education, the benefits of learning to read and write, the simple joy of classroom camaraderie. She spoke of the law, which required children to attend school. Mrs. Lamont simply nodded, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She said that she appreciated the teacher's concern. She explained that their children were educated at home, that they were special cases, each one of them, and required a delicate touch. Miss Reed persisted, her sense of duty overriding her growing unease. She said that she only needed to enroll one, to begin with. She pointed through the window to a boy who stood perfectly still by the fence line, staring into the woods. She asked for his name, his date of birth, the town he was from. Mrs. Lamont's smile never wavered. She told the teacher that the boy's name was Jacob. She said that his past was a sad one, best left undisturbed. She said that all her children had come from places of sorrow, and that the Lamonts had given them a new beginning, a life without papers and painful records. Her voice was like soft velvet, but her words were like a stone wall. Miss Reed pressed further, asking for a baptismal record, a birth certificate, anything at all to place the boy in the world officially. Mrs. Lamont simply replied that their family was a blessing heaven had chosen not to record on paper. The statement was so strange, so poetic, and so utterly final that Miss Reed found she had no further questions. She left the farmhouse with her enrollment papers still blank. The image of the silent, staring boy burned into her mind. Driven by a sense of professional obligation and a growing, gnawing curiosity, Miss Evelyn Reed did not let the matter rest. She went to the county clerk's office the following day. The office was located in the larger town of Oak Haven, a full day's ride from Harmony Creek. It was a stern, granite building filled with the scent of aging paper and sealing wax. The county clerk was a man named Mr. Arthur Gable, a meticulous and humorless individual who believed that a person's entire existence could and should be contained within a few neat lines of ink in his ledgers. He prided himself on the completeness of his records. Miss Reed explained the situation, her voice low and confidential. She spoke of a family in Harmony Creek, the Lamonts, who had adopted 12 children. She needed to find their records. Mr. Gable listened, his fingers steepled, a small frown deepening the lines on his forehead. He did not approve of irregularities. He pulled down the heavy leather-bound book that held the adoption records for the past 5 years. He ran a bony finger down the alphabetized pages, his lips moving silently. He found nothing under the name Lamont. He checked the records for the surrounding counties, his search methodical and exhaustive. He found no trace of any adoptions filed by Silas or Alara Lamont. He told Miss Reed that such a thing was impossible. An adoption was a legal process, a matter of public record. 12 adoptions would have produced a mountain of paperwork. To have no record at all was not just an oversight, it was a legal absurdity. He then turned to the birth registries, thinking perhaps the children were illegitimate relatives, passed quietly to the Lamonts to avoid scandal. He searched for births with the surname Lamont, then for any births where the parents were unknown. He spent the entire afternoon poring over his books, the silence in the room broken only by the dry rustle of turning pages. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the dusty office. At the end of it all, he had found nothing. 12 children had appeared in Harmony Creek, fully formed, without a single piece of paper to herald their arrival. They did not exist in the state's official memory. According to the meticulous records of Mr. Arthur Gable, the 12 Lamont children were ghosts. They had no past, no place of origin, no legal existence. They were a blank space where a story should have been. The clerk, a man who had dedicated his life to the certainty of the written record, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. He informed the school teacher, his voice now a strained whisper, that the children she spoke of were not in his books. They were, for all official purposes, nowhere. The mystery deepened and spread through the town like a slow-moving fog. The Lamonts remained polite and distant, their serene smiles deflecting any and all inquiries. Their children remained silent and watchful. The situation might have remained a piece of unsettling local gossip, a story to be told on long winter nights, had it not been for the arrival of a traveling census taker in the spring of 1905. His name was Thomas Abernathy, a pragmatic man who had seen much of the country and its people. His job was to count and record, to turn lives into numbers for the government. He arrived at the Lamont farm on a Tuesday, his satchel full of forms and his mind on his work. He, too, was met with the Lamont's impenetrable calm. Mr. Lamont answered his questions politely but vaguely. He gave his own name and his wife's, their ages and former occupations. When Abernathy asked about the children, Mr. Lamont simply stated that they had 12. He gave no names, no ages, no places of birth. He just said that they were his children, and that was all the record the world required. Abernathy, a man accustomed to reluctant and suspicious citizens, was not so easily deterred. He insisted that the law required a full accounting. Mr. Lamont's pleasant expression hardened almost imperceptibly. He told the census taker that his work on their property was finished. Frustrated and intrigued, Abernathy did not leave Harmony Creek immediately. He went to the town hall to consult the official land deeds, wanting to know more about the history of the Lamont property. He unrolled the old brittle maps of the county. his fingers tracing the property lines of the old McGregor farm. It was there he found the note, a small annotation in faded brown ink on a map dated 1848. The land had not always been a farm. It had once been the site of the Harmony County Almshouse, a poorhouse for the indigent and the orphaned. He cross-referenced this with the town's historical records, a collection of dusty, disorganized volumes kept in the back of the clerk's office. He found an entry for the year 1849. The Harmony County Almshouse had burned to the ground in a sudden and suspicious fire late one winter's night. The building was old, a tinderbox, and help had been slow to arrive. The report stated that there had been no known survivors among the orphans housed in the Maine dormitory. Their identities, like so much else in the region's hard history, were never officially recorded. The census taker stood in the quiet, dusty room, the smell of old paper filling his lungs. He looked from the report of the fire to the map showing the location of the old almshouse. The land where the orphans had perished, the land where nothing was ever recorded, was the very same land where Mr. and Mrs. Lamont now raised their 12 silent, paperless children. The discovery in the town hall archive settled like a cold stone in the stomach of Thomas Abernathy, the traveling census taker. He was a man of ledgers and lists, of verifiable facts and neatly organized columns. His world was one of paper and ink, a world where every person had a line, a number, a place. The story of the Lamont children was a direct assault on that world. It was a tear in the fabric of his understanding. He stood in the silence of the records room, the faint, dry scent of decaying paper all around him, and stared at the notation about the almshouse fire of 1849. A place of forgotten children, consumed by fire, on the exact same soil where a new group of forgotten children now resided. It was a coincidence so profound it felt like a deliberate, mocking design. Thomas Abernathy was a methodical man by trade, but he was also a father of 2 young daughters, a detail he rarely shared with the strangers he documented. The thought of any child, let alone 12, existing without a name in a book, without an anchor to the world, disturbed him on a level far deeper than professional frustration. He knew that the official records, the cold, brittle pages in front of him, could only tell him so much. History, he understood, was not just written in ink. It was carried in the memories of the people who lived it. He asked the town clerk who in Harmony Creek kept the old stories, the unofficial history that never made it into the county ledgers. The clerk, without a moment's hesitation, directed him to a man named Ezra Colvin. Ezra Colvin, the town's unofficial historian, was a man as old and weathered as the town itself. He lived in a small, cluttered cottage at the end of a lane overgrown with weeds, his home a library of local lore, filled with yellowed newspaper clippings, clouded glass bottles dug up from old homesteads, and books whose spines had long since turned to dust. He smelled of pipe tobacco and wood smoke, and his eyes, though clouded with age, held the sharp, knowing glint of a man who had seen too many winters to be surprised by anything. Abernathy found him sitting on his porch, carving a piece of pine wood into the shape of a bird. The census taker introduced himself and his purpose, explaining the discrepancy he had found, the impossible family on the old McGregor farm. Ezra Colvin did not seem surprised. He slowly set down his carving and his knife, his movements deliberate. He told Abernathy to sit. He said that some stories do not fit neatly into a government book. He explained that the land the Lamants had bought was not good land. It was not a matter of soil or water, he clarified, but of memory. The ground itself, he said, remembered what had happened there. He then began to speak of the fire, his voice a low, raspy whisper that seemed to draw the shadows of the afternoon closer around them. He said the winter of 1849 had been one of the cruelest in living memory. The snow had come early and stayed late, burying the world in a deep, suffocating white. The almshouse, he recounted, was little more than a poorly constructed wooden box, a place the town tried not to think about. It was filled with the children no one wanted, the orphans and the abandoned, their faces pale from hunger and their futures even paler. The fire had started late at night, during a storm that rattled the windows of every home in Harmony Creek. He said the flames were visible from miles away, a terrible orange gash against the black, swirling snow. By the time anyone could organize a response, it was too late. The structure was consumed with a terrifying speed, the dry timber of its walls turning to ash in minutes. The historian paused, his gaze fixed on the distant tree line where the Lamont property lay hidden from view. He told Abernathy the most terrible part was not the fire itself, but the silence that followed. There were rumors, he whispered, that the town's leaders had been slow to respond on purpose. The almshouse was a drain on the meager town funds, a constant nagging reminder of their collective poverty. Some said the fire was a blessing, a cruel and final solution to a problem no one knew how to solve. When the embers cooled the next morning, there was nothing left but a blackened foundation and a handful of charred bones. No one knew exactly how many children had been inside. The records were incomplete, the children themselves transient. They buried what little they found in a single, unmarked trench at the back of the cemetery, the one that shared a property line with the almshouse grounds. Their names were never carved into stone because no one was certain of all their names. They were the children who had never officially existed, and so in death, they remained unrecorded. Ezra Colvin looked at Thomas Abernathy then, his old eyes holding a deep and ancient sorrow. He said that the land had been salted with the ashes of forgotten children, and that nothing good had ever grown there since. The census taker, a man who dealt in facts, found himself deep in the realm of folklore. He asked the old historian what he meant. Ezra explained that the McGregor family, who had farmed the land for 50 years before the Lamonts arrived, had been plagued by misfortune. He spoke of seasons where their crops would inexplicably wither and die, while their neighbors' fields thrived. He told of healthy livestock that would sicken and perish overnight without any discernible cause. The most chilling story he recounted was that of the McGregor's own daughter, a girl named Sarah. One summer evening, she had been playing by the old stone wall that separated the farm from the cemetery. She vanished, just disappeared between one moment and the next. The whole town had searched for weeks. They found no tracks, no sign of a struggle, nothing. She was simply gone, swallowed by the land. The McGregors sold the farm a year later, broken by the loss. The property had sat empty for years, shunned and feared, until the Lammonts, outsiders with no knowledge of the local history, had purchased it. Thomas Abernathy left the old historian's cottage with a profound sense of dread. The neat lines of his census forms seemed hopelessly inadequate to capture the darkness that clung to this corner of Maine. The story of the fire and the curse on the land was folklore, perhaps, but it resonated with the unsettling reality of the Lamont family. He needed something more concrete, an eyewitness account that could bridge the gap between ghost stories and the present day. His inquiries led him to Jedediah Finch, a quiet, hard-working farmer whose land abutted the back of the Lamont property. Jedediah was a man of few words, his face weathered by the sun and his hands calloused from a lifetime of labor. He was not a man given to fanciful tales. Abernathy found him mending a fence along the edge of his property, the gnarled trees of the cemetery visible just beyond. When Abernathy mentioned the Lamont children, the farmer's face tightened. He looked away, his gaze settling on the silent, brooding woods. He was reluctant to speak, shaking his head and saying it was not his place to pass judgment. But Abernathy pressed, explaining his official role, his need to account for the family. Finally, with a heavy sigh, Jedediah Finch leaned against a fence post and told his story. He said he often worked late in his fields during the planting season, sometimes well after dusk. One night, not long after the Lamonts had moved in, he had been walking the edge of his property when a movement in the cemetery caught his eye. The moon was a thin, silver crescent, providing little light. At first, he thought it was a trick of the shadows, perhaps a deer moving through the tall grass. But then he saw them clearly. It was the Lamont children, all 12 of them. They were moving among the old, tilting gravestones in complete and utter silence. He told Abernathy that they were not playing, not in any way a normal child would play. There was no laughter, no running, no shouting. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace, their pale night clothes making them look like small, wandering spirits in the gloom. He watched them for nearly an hour, hidden behind the stone wall. He said they would stop at the oldest, most weathered stones, the ones whose inscriptions had been erased by a century of wind and rain. They would reach out and touch the rough granite, their small hands tracing patterns that were no longer there. At one point, all 12 of them gathered in a circle in the open space near the back of the cemetery, the very place where Ezra Colvin had said the almshouse orphans were buried. They stood there, perfectly still, their heads bowed as if in prayer or silent communion. The sight, Jedediah said, had frozen the blood in his veins. It was the profound, coordinated silence that was the most terrifying part. They were a single entity, a hive mind of quiet sorrow moving through the forgotten dead. He had fled back to his house that night and had never spoken of it to another soul until now. Armed with the historian's tale and the farmer's chilling testimony, Thomas Abernathy knew he had to make one final attempt. His duty demanded it. He walked the long road back to the Lamont farm, the afternoon sun casting long, distorted shadows before him. As he approached, he saw the children. They were in the yard, arranged in their usual, unnervingly orderly way. They stopped what they were doing and turned, all 12 of them, to watch him approach. Their gray eyes were empty of curiosity, empty of any recognizable emotion. They were like the lenses of a camera, simply recording his presence. The air grew still and heavy. Mr. and Mrs. Lamont met him on the porch. Their faces were as calm and pleasant as they had been on his first visit. They showed no surprise, no agitation at his return. It was as if they had been expecting him. Abernathy did not bother with the pleasantries this time. He kept his voice steady and official, but the words felt strange and flimsy in the face of the family's placid certainty. He told them that he had been to the town archives. He told them that their land was the former site of the Harmony County almshouse. He spoke of the fire in the winter of 1849 and of the undocumented orphans who had perished in the flames. He looked from Mrs. Lamont's serene face to Mr. Lamont's stoic expression and asked them, his voice dropping to a near whisper, where their children had truly come from. Mr. Silas Lamont looked at his wife, a silent, knowing glance passing between them. The 12 children stood in the yard, unmoving, their collective gaze fixed upon the census taker. They did not blink. For a long moment, the only sound was the rustle of the wind in the tall pines that bordered the property. Then, Mrs. Alara Lamont smiled, a gentle, pitying expression. She told Thomas Abernathy that he was a man who put too much faith in paper and ink. She said that some families are not forged by law or recorded in books. She looked out at the 12 pale, silent figures in the yard, her gaze soft and maternal. She then said that their family was a blessing from heaven, a special gift. And it was a blessing, she concluded, that heaven had simply chosen never to record on paper. The statement was delivered with such simple, unshakable conviction that it left no room for argument. It was an answer that was not an answer, a wall of faith against a world of facts. Thomas Abernathy, a man of records, stood before a family that claimed to have none, and for the first time in his career, he had nothing left to write down. The departure of the census taker, Thomas Abernathy, did not close the matter. It did the opposite. His questions, his frantic search through the town's old books, had stirred the quiet dust of Harmony Creek's unease. He left behind a void, a series of unanswered questions that hung in the air like smoke. The townspeople now had a name for the feeling that had been growing within them. It was the dread of the unrecorded, the fear of a thing that lived and breathed but cast no shadow on the official pages of the world. The story of the almshouse fire, once a piece of half-forgotten history, was now spoken in hushed tones at the general store and over dinner tables. The Lamont family, once seen as a pillar of charity, was now viewed through a lens of dark suspicion. They were an anomaly, a living contradiction to the orderly progression of life, birth, and death that the town understood. Their very existence felt like a challenge to the laws of man, and perhaps to the laws of God. This challenge was felt most acutely by Mr. Arthur Gable, the county clerk in Oak Haven. The census taker's visit had left a deep and festering wound in his professional pride. Mr. Gable's life was a fortress built of paper, his ledgers the unbreachable walls. He believed with an almost religious fervor that a fact was not a fact until it was written down in his elegant, looping script, the ink drying permanent and irrefutable upon the page. The 12 Lamont children represented a failure of his system, a cohort of phantoms wandering the world outside his authority. It was an intolerable state of affairs. After a week of sleepless nights, his dreams filled with blank pages and fading words, he resolved to correct this oversight himself. He would create a record where none existed. He would force the Lamont children onto the page, and in doing so, force them into the known world. He sent a letter by courier to Miss Evelyn Reed, the school teacher in Harmony Creek. He requested that she procure the names and approximate ages of all 12 children. He explained it was for a supplementary county census, a minor administrative task. Miss Reed, still haunted by her own encounter with the family, complied with a mixture of reluctance and grim duty. She went back to the Lamont farm, not approaching the house this time, but speaking to the children over the fence as they stood in the yard. She asked for their names. In a strange, soft chorus, a sound like the rustling of dry leaves, they spoke them: Jacob, Samuel, Elias, Daniel, Peter, Caleb, Sarah, Leah, Rachel, Mary, Hannah, Esther. 12 names, simple and biblical. They offered no ages, only their names. She wrote them down, her hand trembling slightly, and sent the list back to Mr. Gable. With the list in his possession, Arthur Gable felt a surge of triumphant purpose. He waited until nightfall, when the courthouse was empty and silent. He preferred to work on his most important records at night, believing the quiet concentration improved the quality of his penmanship. He lit a single oil lamp, its golden light pushing back the deep shadows of his office. He laid out a fresh, pristine page for a new family register. He opened a new bottle of his finest gall ink, a deep and permanent black that was his own special formulation, guaranteed to outlast the memory of any living man. He dipped his favorite steel nib pen into the inkwell, the sharp point glistening in the lamplight. One by one, he began to write. Lamont, Jacob. The name flowed from his pen, a perfect, elegant script. Lamont, Samuel. Lamont, Elias. He wrote all 12 names, each one a small victory over the chaos of the unknown. He added the family's address, the notation adopted, and left the spaces for birth dates and origins conspicuously blank, a silent testament to the mystery he was in the process of conquering. When he was finished, he sat back and admired his work. The page was clean, orderly, and authoritative. The 12 names sat in a neat column, captured and contained by the power of his record. He had pinned them to the page, given them an official existence. Satisfied, he carefully blotted the page, closed the heavy ledger, and locked it away in the county's fireproof safe. He went home that night and slept, for the first time in weeks, a deep and dreamless sleep. He returned to his office the next morning as the sun was streaming through the tall, arched windows. He felt a sense of profound satisfaction, the quiet joy of a craftsman who has completed a difficult but essential task. He decided to look at the page one more time before filing it away permanently. He retrieved the ledger from the safe, the heavy book cool and solid in his hands. He opened it to the page he had so carefully prepared the night before, and he stared. His heart grew cold. The page was not as he had left it. The ink, his permanent, unyielding ink, was faded. It was not the crisp, definitive black he had applied with such care. It was a pale, ghostly gray, like a memory of a word rather than the word itself. He touched a finger to one of the names. The ink was dry, but it looked frail, ancient, as if it had been written a century ago and left to bleach in the sun. A tremor started in his hand. This was impossible. His ink did not fade. It was his trade secret, a source of immense pride. He thought perhaps the lamplight had deceived him, that the ink had been watered down. He took out his pen and the same bottle of ink from the night before. He carefully traced over the first name, Lamont, Jacob, forcing the new dark ink into the faint lines of the old. The black liquid pooled on the page, sharp and clear. For a moment, he felt relief. But as he watched, a thing happened that made the blood drain from his face. The fresh ink began to recede. It did not sink into the paper. It seemed to shrink away from the ghostly letters beneath it, pulling back into itself, lightening from black to gray to a faint, barely visible shimmer before disappearing completely. It was as if the page itself was refusing the ink, refusing the name. He tried again, his hand now shaking violently. He wrote the name beside the faded one, on a clean part of the paper. Lamont, Jacob. The ink sat there for a second, dark and wet, and then it too began to pale. It dissolved into the fibers of the paper, not spreading, but simply vanishing, like a drop of water on a hot stove. He tried another name, then another. The result was the same. The page would not hold the record. It was a living, breathing rejection of his authority. Mr. Arthur Gable, a man who had built his life on the permanence of the written word, was confronted with a record that would not be written. He was left with a page of ghosts, the faint, gray outlines of 12 names that refused to be born into his world of official fact. He slammed the ledger shut, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He locked the book away and never spoke of the Lamont family again. The fear of a world where records were meaningless was a terror too profound for him to confront. That same summer, a new and modern marvel arrived in the region. Mr. Ansel Blackwood, a traveling photographer, came to Oakhaven with his wagon full of mysterious equipment. He carried a large format view camera, a tripod as sturdy as a small tree, and a collection of heavy glass plates. Photography was a novelty, a kind of magic that could capture a moment and hold it still for all time. Mr. Blackwood was an artist as much as a technician. He took pride in his portraits, in his ability to capture not just a likeness, but the very essence of a person. He heard tales of the Lamonts, the pious couple with their sprawling, silent family. To him, this was not a story of dread, but of aesthetic perfection. A family of 14, all dressed in simple, matching clothes, posed against the rustic backdrop of their farm. It would be his masterpiece, a portrait that would speak of family, of faith, of the stark and simple beauty of rural life. He made the journey to Harmony Creek, his mind already composing the image. He found the Lamants to be ideal subjects. They agreed to the portrait without hesitation, their faces betraying no emotion at all. Mrs. Lamont prepared the children, smoothing their hair and straightening their collars. They were unnervingly cooperative. Mr. Blackwood arranged them in a carefully composed tableau in front of the old farmhouse. Mr. and Mrs. Lamont sat in 2 straight-backed chairs, their hands folded in their laps. The 12 children stood behind and around them, a perfect, symmetrical arrangement of pale faces and dark clothes. They stood perfectly still, their gray eyes staring directly into the brass lens of his camera. They did not fidget or complain during the long, arduous process of focusing and preparing the plate. They seemed to be statues, devoid of the usual restlessness of children. Mr. Blackwood worked under the black cloth of his camera, his world reduced to the upside-down image on the ground glass. The stillness of his subjects was a photographer's dream, yet he felt a growing chill despite the summer heat. Their silence was absolute. He uncovered the lens for the exposure, counting the seconds aloud. 1, 2, 3, 4. He slid the cover back into place. The moment was captured. He felt a surge of artistic pride. He packed up his equipment, thanked the silent family, and promised to return with a print in 1 week's time. Back in the temporary darkroom he had set up in his Oak Haven hotel room, he began the delicate chemical process of developing the glass plate negative. He slid the plate into the tray of developer, gently rocking it back and forth in the dim, red light. He waited for the image to emerge, for the pale faces of the children to slowly appear out of the chemical gray. He waited, and he waited. Nothing happened. The plate remained a uniform, murky gray. There were no faces, no farmhouse, no sky. There was nothing. He thought he must have made an error. Perhaps he had forgotten to remove the lens cap, a novice mistake he had not made in years. Or perhaps the plate itself was faulty. He had taken a second photograph that day, a landscape of the creek, as a test. He developed that plate. The image emerged perfectly, the trees and the water sharp and clear. It was not his equipment. It was not his process. He went back to the first plate, the family portrait. He tried a different chemical bath, a longer development time. The result was the same, a perfect, featureless blank. It was as if the camera, his infallible machine for capturing light, had seen nothing at all when he had pointed it at the Lamont family. It was as if they had not been there, as if 14 people, standing in the bright Maine sunlight, had reflected no light, had left no impression on the sensitive silver of his plate. Ansel Blackwood, a man who captured reality for a living, was left with a piece of glass that testified to an impossible absence. He packed his wagon that night and left the region, abandoning his masterpiece, taking with him only a cold and inexplicable fear. The final attempt to officially document the children came from the church. Father Alistair Finch was a young priest, recently assigned to the parish of St. James. He was a scholarly man, trained in theology and canon law, and he possessed the fiery certainty of youth. He believed that the church was a house of order, its sacraments the sacred and necessary markers of a Christian life. A soul's journey began with baptism. Its name entered into the parish register, which was not just a book of paper, but a local echo of the great book of life. When he learned of the 12 unbaptized children living within his parish, he saw it as a grave and urgent spiritual crisis. It was his sacred duty to bring these lost lambs into the fold. He went to the Lamont farm, his Bible in his hand. He spoke to Mr. and Mrs. Lamont with a gentle but firm authority. He explained that baptism was not optional. It was a divine command, the gateway to salvation. He said that a child without baptism was a child left to wander in the wilderness, unprotected. Mr. and Mrs. Lamont listened with their usual infuriating calm. They told the priest that they appreciated his concern for their children's souls, but they said their children had already been blessed, that their family was a private covenant with God, and it required no public ceremony. Father Alistair Finch was not swayed by what he considered to be a dangerously misguided piety. He insisted. He told them he would be back on the following Sunday to perform the sacrament in their home, as the children were clearly not ready to receive it in the church. He would bring the holy water and the consecrated oils himself. His tone made it clear that this was not a request. He would not allow 12 souls to remain unrecorded in the eyes of God and his church while he was their shepherd. On Sunday, he returned as promised. The Lamonts received him, their faces impassive. The 12 children were gathered in the main room of the farmhouse, standing in their usual silent rows. The room was cold, despite a small fire in the hearth. The priest began the rite, his voice filling the quiet room with the ancient Latin phrases. He took the first child, a boy named Jacob, by the hand. He led him to the small table where he had placed the bowl of holy water. He dipped his thumb into the water and prepared to make the sign of the cross on the boy's forehead. He looked down into the child's face, and he saw nothing. It was not that the boy's eyes were merely blank or empty in a metaphorical sense. The priest, in that moment, felt as though he were looking into a void, a profound and absolute emptiness that seemed to pull at his own spirit. There was no soul there. There was no light, no fear, no innocence, no spark of the divine that he believed resided in every human child. He was looking at a perfectly rendered but hollow vessel. The boy's eyes were deep, gray pools of nothingness. The priest's hand froze. The Latin words died on his lips. His faith, his entire understanding of the world, fractured. He stumbled backward, dropping the bowl of holy water, which shattered on the wooden floor. He turned and fled the house, the 12 pairs of empty eyes following him. The next morning, a parishioner found Father Alistair Finch in his rectory. He was in his bed, stricken with a violent fever, his body shaking uncontrollably. He was delirious, muttering phrases that made no sense. He spoke of empty houses, of hollow dolls, of eyes that were not eyes but windows into a great and terrible darkness. He kept repeating a single phrase, over and over again, his voice a hoarse, terrified whisper. He said they had no names to be written. The town doctor could find no cause for the illness. The priest remained in that state for a week, and when the fever finally broke, he was a changed man. His youthful certainty was gone, replaced by a deep and haunted fear. He requested a transfer and left Harmony Creek a month later, a man broken by a sacrament he could not perform. After the failure of the clerk, the photographer, and the priest, the town of Harmony Creek made its final, unspoken judgment. The Laments and their children were not to be approached. They were to be avoided. A wide, invisible circle of fear was drawn around the old McGregor farm. People would cross the street to avoid walking past their property. Their wagon was given a wide berth when it came into town for supplies. The whispers no longer spoke of generosity or strangeness, but of curses and of things that were not right. The family was ostracized, left alone in their silent, orderly world. Yet, this isolation seemed to have a strange effect. The family did not shrink from the town's fear. They seemed, in some inexplicable way, to thrive on it, and a new, more terrifying rumor began to circulate, a story told only late at night, far from any open windows. A farmer, returning home late, swore that he had counted the figures playing in the Lamont's yard in the deep twilight, and he had counted not 12, but 13. The town's avoidance of the Lamont family created a vacuum, a space of quiet observation. With direct interaction ceasing, the people of Harmony Creek became watchers. From behind lace curtains, from the shadowed doorways of barns, from the high seats of wagons passing on the main road, they watched the farm on the edge of town. They cataloged the small, daily routines of the impossible family, and the more they watched, the more the fabric of their reality began to fray at the edges. The children, now completely isolated from the community, began to display behaviors that moved beyond mere strangeness into the realm of the deeply unnatural. They were no longer just a silent, solemn group. They were becoming something else, a single organism with 12 bodies, a reflection in a dozen shattered mirrors. The idyllic surface, already cracked, began to crumble away, revealing a terrifying, synchronized strangeness beneath. Miss Evelyn Reed, the school teacher, had not given up entirely on the idea of integrating the children. Her sense of duty was a stubborn, deeply ingrained thing. Though the children were not enrolled in her classes, she had insisted that they be allowed to join the other students in the schoolyard during the daily recess. She believed, with a fading optimism, that the simple, chaotic joy of play might break through their silent reserve. Mr. and Mrs. Lamont had agreed to this arrangement with their usual placid indifference. So, every day, the 12 children would walk to the school, not entering the building, but standing along the splintered wooden fence that bordered the yard, watching the town's children play. They did not participate. They simply stood in a neat line, their hands clasped behind their backs, their gray eyes following the motion of the games with an unreadable intensity. For weeks, this silent vigil was the only change. The town's children, after a few failed attempts at engagement, learned to ignore the 12 silent figures at the edge of their world. They ran and shouted, played tag and skipped rope, their noisy, vibrant life a stark contrast to the statues by the fence. Then came an afternoon in late spring. The air was warm and smelled of freshly turned earth. A group of boys was throwing a worn leather ball back and forth. One throw went wild, and the ball bounced across the yard, rolling to a stop just a few feet from the Lamont children. A boy named Henry Gable, the 10-year-old nephew of the county clerk, ran to retrieve it. He was a bold and curious child, less intimidated by the strange family than his peers. He picked up the ball and, on an impulse, turned to the silent observers. He looked at the boy who stood at the center of the line, a child they called Jacob. Henry offered a small, hesitant smile. He said he had never seen them play. He asked if they wanted to join the game. It was a simple, kind gesture, a child's attempt to bridge the chasm of strangeness that separated them. The response was not what he expected. Jacob did not answer. Instead, a change came over the entire line of 12 children. In perfect, flawless unison, every head turned to face Henry Gable. The movement was not human. It was mechanical, like the synchronized flipping of cards in a deck. 12 pairs of gray eyes, all identical in their cold, empty focus, fixed upon him. The chaotic noise of the schoolyard seemed to fall away, replaced by a sudden, profound silence. Even the birds in the nearby trees seemed to stop singing. Then they spoke. Their mouths opened at the exact same instant, and from those 12 mouths came a single voice. It was not a shout, nor was it a whisper. It was a clear, resonant tone, a perfect chorus that sounded both like a child and like something ancient. The voice had a strange, layered quality, as if a single word was being spoken through 12 different instruments at once. The voice said that the ball did not belong to him. It said that the yard did not belong to them. It said that nothing belonged to anyone. The words were simple, but the unified, otherworldly delivery drained them of any human meaning. They were a pronouncement, a statement of fact from a place that did not recognize the concept of ownership or play or childhood. Henry Gable froze, the leather ball dropping from his hand and landing with a soft thud in the dust. The other children in the yard stood like statues, their games forgotten, their faces a mixture of shock and terror. Miss Evelyn Reed, who had been watching from the schoolhouse window, felt a coldness spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. She saw the absolute unity of the children, the impossible synchronicity of their speech. She understood in that moment that she was not looking at 12 separate children. She was looking at one will, one thought, distributed across 12 bodies. The Lamont children lowered their heads in unison, their attention broken. Henry Gable slowly, carefully, backed away. He did not turn his back until he was safely with his friends. The recess ended early that day. The children were sent home, and the schoolyard was left empty, save for the single leather ball lying in the dust. The Lamont children never returned. The second observation was more intimate, and in its way, more terrifying. It was witnessed by a single man, Mr. Robert Shaw, the town blacksmith. Mr. Shaw was a man of substance and practicality. He dealt in fire and iron, in the solid, unyielding realities of the physical world. He was not a man given to flights of fancy or ghost stories. His forge was located at the edge of town, on the road that led out toward the Lamont farm. His work required him to keep odd hours, and he often found himself banking the coals of his forge as dusk settled over the valley. He had seen the Lamont family pass by his workshop many times, a silent procession on their way to or from the general store. He watched them with a blacksmith's professional curiosity, noting their identical, sturdy shoes and the unnerving precision of their steps. One evening in the early summer, he was standing in the deep shadow of his open doorway, wiping the sweat and soot from his face with a damp rag. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of deep orange and purple. He saw the Lamont family walking home, Mrs. Lamont leading the way, the 12 children following in their usual 2 straight lines. The road was uneven, littered with loose stones and gravel. As they passed his forge, one of the girls, a child named Sarah, caught her foot on a stone and stumbled. It was a common, clumsy accident, the kind that happens to any child. She fell to her knee, putting out her right hand to break the fall. Her palm landed hard on a shard of sharp, upturned rock. Mr. Shaw watched, expecting a cry of pain, perhaps tears. There was none. The girl, Sarah, simply pushed herself up and stood. She looked down at her right hand. A thin, dark line of blood was welling up in her palm, a clean, deep cut. Mrs. Lamont stopped and turned, her face showing no alarm. The other 11 children also stopped. They did not rush to their sister's side. They did not gasp or show any concern. They simply stopped and stood, a silent, waiting assembly. Then, the impossible thing happened. Mr. Shaw, from his vantage point in the shadows, saw it with his own 2 eyes, as clearly as he saw the anvil in his forge. The 11 other children, the ones who had not fallen, the ones who were standing several feet away, all performed the same action in perfect, slow unison. They raised their own right hands, turning their palms upward to the fading light, and on the soft, unbroken skin of each of their 11 palms, in the exact same location as Sarah's wound, a thin red line of blood appeared. It did not gush. It simply emerged, welling up from beneath the skin, as if from an invisible cut. There was no wound. There was no broken skin. There was only the blood, a perfect, sympathetic echo of the original injury. 12 small right hands, each marked with an identical, bleeding line. The children looked at the blood on their palms, not with pain or fear, but with a detached, placid curiosity. It was as if they were observing a mildly interesting natural phenomenon, like the unfurling of a leaf. Mrs. Lamont calmly took a clean white handkerchief from her pocket. She walked to the original girl, Sarah, and gently wiped the blood from her hand. As she did so, the blood on the other 11 hands began to recede. It did not drip or smear. It simply sank back into the skin, vanishing as mysteriously as it had appeared, leaving the palms pale and unblemished. The entire event had taken less than a minute. Mrs. Lamont folded the handkerchief, put it back in her pocket, and the family resumed their walk home, their formation as neat and orderly as before. They left Mr. Robert Shaw standing in the doorway of his forge, his mind struggling to reconcile the solid world of iron he knew with the impossible biology he had just witnessed. He was a man who understood cause and effect, the hammer striking the hot metal. What he had seen was an effect without a cause, a wound without a weapon, a shared pain in bodies that were supposed to be separate. The coldness he felt had nothing to do with the coming night. The final and most profound strangeness was not an event, but a gradual, creeping realization that dawned upon the entire town over the course of years. Time in Harmony Creek was measured by the turning of the seasons, the height of the corn, and the growth of its children. Babies became toddlers, toddlers became children, and children grew into young adults. It was the fundamental, undeniable rhythm of life. The town watched its own children shoot up, their limbs lengthening, their faces changing, their voices deepening, but the Lamont children remained unchanged. 1 year passed after their arrival, then a second, and then a third. The seasons turned. The harsh winters buried the farm in snow, and the lush summers surrounded it with green. The children of Harmony Creek, who had been 10 years old when the Lamonts arrived, were now 13. They were taller, more awkward, on the cusp of adulthood, but the 12 Lamont children remained 10. Their faces retained the same smooth, pale quality. Their bodies did not grow. Their hair did not seem to get any longer. They were a fixed point in a flowing river, a photograph that refused to age. This was noticed in small, cumulative ways. Mrs. Gable, the proprietor of the general store, noticed that the children's coats, the same dark gray woolen coats they had arrived in, still fit them perfectly 3 winters later. Father Alistair Finch, before he left, had noted in the parish records that the children's names were entered without a date of birth, but his successor noted that they never seemed to require a new entry for confirmation, for they never visibly aged toward it. Farmers who saw them in their yard from a distance realized that the figures they saw in 1904 were indistinguishable from the figures they saw in 1907. They were caught in a single, unending moment of childhood. This defiance of time was, to the people of Harmony Creek, the most terrifying trait of all. It was a fundamental violation of the natural order. It suggested that they were not living things in the way the town understood life. Living things grew, changed, and eventually died. The Lamont children simply were. They were a constant, an unchanging variable in the town's equation. This unnerving permanence, combined with their synchronized actions and their shared physical sensations, began to weave together the disparate threads of fear into a single, cohesive theory. It was a theory born of desperation, an attempt to explain the inexplicable. The old stories, the ones told by Ezra Colvin about the almshouse fire, were no longer just stories. They became the key. The townspeople began to whisper. They remembered that the orphans who had died in the fire were all children. They remembered that their exact number was never known. They remembered that they were buried in an unmarked grave on that same cursed piece of land. The whispers grew into a conviction, a shared and secret belief passed between neighbors in hushed tones. If the children did not age, it was because they were not truly alive. If they acted as one, it was because they were not separate souls. If they bled together, it was because their bodies were not their own. The conclusion was as insane as it was inescapable. The rumor, the deep and abiding belief that took root in the town's collective heart, was that Silas and Alara Lamont had never adopted any children at all. They had come to that place of ash and sorrow and, through some dark and unholy art, had called back the spirits of the children who had burned. They had given them new bodies, perfect and identical, but they were hollow vessels, animated by the lingering, unified tragedy of their fiery death. The Lamonts were not parents, they were necromancers, and their children were not adopted, they were resurrected. The fear that had taken root in Harmony Creek was no longer a quiet, creeping vine of suspicion. It had grown into a thick, thorny hedge that surrounded the town, isolating it and choking the life from it. The rumor of the resurrected children, a story born from the town's collective dread, was now accepted as fact. The Lamont children were not children. They were shades, specters, a living echo of a past tragedy that had never been properly put to rest. This belief changed everything. It shifted the problem from a social anomaly to a spiritual contagion. The townsfolk now looked at the old McGregor farm not just with fear, but with a kind of holy terror. They believed the land itself was poisoned, and that the poison was beginning to spread. The first tangible evidence of this spread appeared in the summer of 1908, 4 full years after the Lamont's arrival. The blight began in the fields closest to the Lamont property. It started in Jedediah Finch's cornfield, the one that bordered the old cemetery. The corn stalks, which should have been tall and green, turned a sickly, bruised purple at the base. The leaves yellowed and withered, and the ears of corn that formed were small, shriveled, and covered in a fine gray mold. It was a disease no one had ever seen before. It did not behave like a normal blight, which might spread with the wind or the rain. This blight seemed to seep out from the Lamont property line, a slow, inexorable tide of decay. It stopped precisely at the boundaries of the Lamont farm, whose own gardens remained inexplicably lush and green. But it moved outward, field by field, claiming the crops of every farm that bordered the cursed land. This was no longer a matter of unsettling whispers or strange behavior. This was a direct threat to the town's survival. A failed harvest meant a winter of hunger. The farmers, practical men who had little time for ghost stories, were now the most fervent believers in the town's dark theory. They saw the dying crops as a deliberate act, an attack by the unnatural family on the town that had shunned them. The fear that had been a private, internal affair now became a public crisis. Panic began to bubble just beneath the surface of the town's stoic demeanor. Something had to be done. The town could not survive a winter of both fear and famine. A special meeting of the town council was called. It was held at night in the small, wood-paneled room of the town hall. The air was thick with the smell of lamp oil and the sweat of anxious men. The council was made up of the town's most respected figures, the owner of the general store, the head of the church vestry, and 2 of the largest landowners. Presiding over the meeting was Sheriff Cormac Blackwood. Sheriff Blackwood was a broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, a man whose entire life had been dedicated to the simple, observable laws of cause and effect. He had arrested drunks, settled land disputes, and tracked down stray livestock. He was not equipped, by temperament or by training, to deal with a resurrected family that was allegedly blighting the town's crops. Yet, the duty fell to him. He listened as the farmers spoke, their voices tight with anger and fear. They described the unnatural decay of their fields. They spoke of the Lamont children, who never aged, who bled as one, who spoke with a single voice. They demanded that the sheriff take action. They told him to drive the family out, to burn the farm to the ground if necessary, to cleanse the town of their presence. The sheriff was a man of the law, and the law had no provision for expelling a family based on rumors of necromancy. He explained this, his voice a low, steady rumble in the tense room. He said that the Lamonts had broken no laws. They paid their taxes. They kept to themselves. It was then that Ezra Colvin, the old historian who had been invited to the meeting for his knowledge of the past, spoke for the first time. His voice was frail but carried the weight of authority. He said that they were not dealing with a matter of man's law. He said they were dealing with a wound in the world, an old sin that had been left to fester. He recounted the story of the almshouse fire again, reminding them all of the forgotten, unmourned children. He suggested that the power of the Lamont children, if that is what they were, came from their unity. They were a collective, a single spirit in 12 bodies. He proposed a desperate, logical, and terrifying idea. If their strength was in their unity, then the solution was to break that unity. They had to separate the children. The plan was as simple as it was audacious. The sheriff, backed by the authority of the council, would go to the farm and remove the children. They would be scattered, one child per household, among 12 of the most respectable and steadfast families in town. They would be kept apart, under lock and key if necessary, until their unnatural connection was severed. The council believed that once separated from each other and from the cursed land, their power would wane. They would become just children, strange and silent, but merely children. It was a desperate gamble, born of a fear that had exhausted all other options. Sheriff Blackwood did not like it. It felt like a violation, a step into a darkness from which there might be no return. But as he looked at the faces of his neighbors, he saw that they were already in that darkness. He agreed. The following morning, Sheriff Blackwood gathered 2 of his most trusted deputies. They rode to the Lamont farm, the sound of their horses' hooves loud in the morning stillness. The farm seemed to watch them as they approached, the windows of the house like vacant eyes. Mr. and Mrs. Lamont met them on the porch. They were not surprised. Their calm was a perfect, infuriating shield. The sheriff, his hat in his hands, explained the council's decision. He spoke of the failing crops, of the town's fear. He said that for the safety of everyone, the children needed to be temporarily housed with other families. Mrs. Lamont listened, her hands clasped at her waist. She told the sheriff that he did not understand. She said their children could not be separated. She said they were not like other children. Mr. Lamont added, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, that what the town council was proposing was not only unwise, but impossible. But the sheriff had his orders. He told them he was not asking for their permission. He and his deputies moved past the couple and into the house. The 12 children were in the main room, standing in their familiar formation. They did not look at the men. They stared at the far wall, their faces pale and unreadable. The sheriff's deputies, both hardened men who had seen their share of trouble, hesitated. The silence in the room was a physical weight. Sheriff Blackwood's voice was rough when he spoke. He assigned each child to one of his deputies, calling out their names from the list he had been given: Jacob, Samuel, Elias. The children did not react. They did not cry or resist. When a deputy took one of them by the hand, the child simply complied, their touch cold and their bodies strangely limp. It was like leading a dozen well-made dolls out of the house. They loaded them into a wagon, the children sitting shoulder to shoulder on the hard wooden benches, their identical gray eyes staring straight ahead. As the wagon pulled away, the sheriff looked back at the farmhouse. Mr. and Mrs. Lamont stood on the porch, side by side. They were not weeping. They were not angry. They were simply watching, their expressions as serene and untroubled as ever. Their stillness was more frightening than any threat. The children were distributed throughout Harmony Creek as planned. Each of the 12 chosen families received one child. They were given rooms, fed, and spoken to with a nervous kindness. The children did not respond. They sat where they were placed, ate what was put before them without a word, and stared into space. As night fell, a profound and uneasy silence settled over the 12 host homes. The families locked their doors, checked on the silent children in their new beds, and tried to sleep, praying that the council's desperate plan would work. The whispers began just after midnight. They did not start in one house, but in all 12 at the exact same moment. It was not the sound of a single child speaking. It was the sound of a multitude. In the home of Robert Shaw, the blacksmith, who had taken the boy named Samuel, the whispers seemed to come from inside the walls, a soft, rustling chorus of voices speaking in a language he did not understand. In the Gable household, where they had taken the girl Leah, the sound was like the wind, but a wind that formed words, speaking of cold ground and of a fire that never went out. Every family heard the same thing, a soft, pervasive, multi-layered whispering that filled every room of the house. It was not loud, but it was inescapable. It spoke of shared memories, of a single, collective sorrow, of a hunger that could not be sated. The families huddled in their beds, sheets pulled up to their chins, listening to the disembodied voices of the separated children, now united in sound. The voices did not stop until the first hint of dawn touched the eastern sky. As the sun rose, they faded away, leaving a silence that was even more terrifying. The 12 host families, exhausted and terror-stricken, crept from their beds. They went to the rooms where they had put the children. Every room was empty. The beds were cold, the sheets undisturbed, as if no one had ever slept in them. The windows were still locked from the inside. The doors were still bolted. There was no sign of entry, no sign of escape. The children had simply vanished. A wave of panic swept through the town as the news spread. People gathered in the street, their faces pale in the early morning light, sharing the same impossible story of whispering voices and vanished children. Then, someone pointed toward the edge of town. A single, collective gasp went through the crowd. There, in the front yard of the old McGregor farm, stood the 12 Lamont children. They were arranged in their perfect, silent rows, just as they always were. It was as if they had never left. They were home. Sheriff Cormac Blackwood, his face a grim mask, went to the farm one last time. He asked the children where they had been. He asked them how they had gotten out of the locked rooms. They looked at him with their empty gray eyes and did not answer. They showed no sign of recognition, no memory of the previous night. It was as if it had never happened. The sheriff, defeated, turned to leave. His youngest deputy, a man named Thomas Pike, had not been one of the 12 hosts. His small house was on the other side of town, far from the main road. He had spent the night alone and had heard nothing. As the sheriff's party walked away from the Lamont farm, Deputy Pike happened to glance toward his own barn. He saw that the large wooden door was slightly ajar. A feeling of cold dread, sharp and specific, pricked at his skin. He had locked that door himself the night before. He walked over, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. He pushed the heavy door open. The barn was silent, filled with the familiar smells of hay and old wood. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of sunlight that lanced through a crack in the roof. The floor of the barn was covered in a thick, undisturbed layer of dust and dirt. Undisturbed, except for one thing. There, leading from the center of the solid back wall, was a single, perfect line of tiny footprints. They were the footprints of a small child, clear and distinct in the dust. They walked across the center of the floor and stopped at the opposite wall. They did not come from the door. They did not lead to the window. They simply appeared out of a solid wooden wall and disappeared into another. Deputy Thomas Pike had not hosted a child. He had not heard the whispers, but the phenomenon had found him anyway. It had left its calling card, a final, inexplicable testament to a power that did not obey the laws of space, or locks, or logic. The failure of the separation plan broke the town's spirit. Their last desperate attempt to impose order had resulted in a display of power more terrifying than anything they had yet witnessed. The fear was no longer a quiet dread. It was a living, breathing entity in the town. The blight in the fields continued its slow, relentless spread. The townspeople now saw it as a punishment for their actions, a quiet, creeping retribution from the children they had tried to scatter. The talk in Harmony Creek turned darker. They had tried man's law. They had tried logic. Now, they began to speak of God's law. They spoke of evil that must be confronted, of a presence that must be cast out. The whispers in the town were no longer about resurrected children. They were now of exorcism, of fire and prayer, of a final, collective confrontation to cleanse their poisoned land. The winter that followed the failed separation was the longest and darkest in Harmony Creek's memory. It was not just the depth of the snow or the brutal, unrelenting cold. It was a winter of the soul. The fear that had once been a current beneath the surface of daily life now became the surface itself. The town was suffocating under the weight of its own terror. The blight had destroyed more than half the autumn harvest, and the meager supplies in the town's cellars and pantries dwindled with alarming speed. Hunger gnawed at the edges of their fear, making it sharper, more desperate. The children of the town grew thin and pale, their laughter a forgotten sound in the hushed, anxious homes. The Lamont farm, however, seemed immune to the hardship. Smoke curled from its chimney every morning, a constant, serene plume against the gray winter sky. The family remained an island of unnatural calm in the town's churning sea of panic. The talk of exorcism, of a holy confrontation, grew from a whisper to a steady, determined murmur. The town's new priest, a timid man who had replaced the broken Father Finch, offered no guidance. He locked himself in the rectory, praying for a deliverance he did not have the courage to bring about himself. The leadership, therefore, fell to the town council and to Sheriff Cormac Blackwood. They had tried reason. They had tried force. Now, they were being pushed toward a final, terrible solution, one that tasted of superstition and witch trials, of a darkness they thought the world had left behind. They began to plan. They would wait for the thaw, for the day the roads were clear enough for every family to gather. They would march to the farm, armed with torches and prayers, and they would not leave until the unholy family was gone. It was a plan forged in the crucible of starvation and terror, a final, desperate stand against the inexplicable. But the thaw, when it came, did not bring a confrontation. It brought a silence more profound and unsettling than any of the strange phenomena that had preceded it. It was Jedediah Finch, the farmer whose land bordered the cemetery, who noticed it first. For 5 years, every single morning without fail, he had seen the smoke rising from the Lamont's chimney. It was as regular as the sunrise. Then, on a Tuesday morning in the first week of April, a morning when the air was finally soft with the promise of spring, there was no smoke. The sky above the farmhouse was clear and empty. Jedediah watched all day. The chimney remained cold. He felt a prickle of unease, a sense of something deeply wrong. The routine had been broken. He watched the next day, and the next. Still, there was no smoke, no sign of life. There were no figures in the yard, no silent processions walking to the store. The farm had fallen completely, utterly still. After the third day of silence, he went to Sheriff Blackwood. The sheriff gathered a small posse of men from the town council. They were armed, though none of them knew what they expected to find. Their hearts pounded with a mixture of hope and a deep, instinctual dread. They rode to the farm, the silence of the place pressing in on them as they drew closer. The farm was pristine. The fences were in good repair. The garden plots were neatly turned over, ready for spring planting. There were no signs of a struggle, no evidence of a hasty departure. It was a picture of perfect, peaceful order. The front door of the farmhouse was unlocked. Sheriff Blackwood pushed it open, the hinges groaning in the silence. The air inside was cool and still, carrying the faint, clean scent of beeswax and dried herbs. The house was immaculate. The floors were swept, the furniture was dusted and arranged with geometric precision. In the main room, the 12 small, straight-backed chairs that the children used were arranged in a perfect circle around the cold hearth. They moved from room to room, their heavy boots echoing on the scrubbed wooden floors. Each room told the same story of abrupt, orderly stillness. In the kitchen, the table was set for a meal that had never been eaten. 14 simple wooden plates were arranged on the table, with 14 sets of polished cutlery laid neatly beside them. A loaf of bread sat on a cutting board, a single slice taken from it. It was as if the family had simply vanished in the middle of preparing their dinner. They went upstairs. The beds were all perfectly made, the woolen blankets pulled tight and smooth, without a single wrinkle. On each of the 12 small beds in the children's dormitory, a single, dark, gray woolen coat was folded neatly at the foot. It was a scene of such profound and tidy emptiness that it was more chilling than any sign of violence could have been. The family had not fled. They had evaporated. They had left behind a perfect, hollow shell of their life. The search continued, growing more desperate. They searched the barn, the fields, the woods that bordered the property. They found nothing. No tracks, no discarded belongings, no clues to where a family of 14 could have gone. Finally, they came to the root cellar. The heavy wooden doors were set into a small mound of earth behind the house. Sheriff Blackwood lifted the thick iron latch and pulled the doors open, revealing a set of steep stone steps leading down into the darkness. A cool, earthy smell rose to meet them. They lit lanterns and descended, their lights cutting through the subterranean gloom. The cellar was large and dry, the stone walls lined with empty shelves where winter preserves would have been kept. The dirt floor was packed hard and smooth. There was nothing here, either. They were about to turn and leave when one of the men, Robert Shaw, the blacksmith, lowered his lantern. In the far corner, almost hidden in the deep shadows, was a row of objects. They were small and dark, arranged with meticulous care. The men gathered around, their lantern light pooling on the cellar floor. They were shoes, 12 pairs of small, sturdy leather shoes, the same kind the children had always worn. They were not thrown in a pile. They were lined up in a perfectly straight row, heel to heel, toe to toe, as if for a military inspection. They were clean, the leather polished, the laces tied. They were empty. It was a final, silent statement, a collection of vessels left behind when their occupants had no more need of them. It was in the small parlor, on a delicate writing desk near the window, that they found the last piece of the puzzle. It was a simple, leather-bound ledger, similar to the ones used in the parish office or the county clerk's records. It was Mrs. Elara Lamont's household account book. The first several pages were filled with mundane entries: the cost of flour, the purchase of seeds, the price of new thread. The handwriting was a graceful, flowing script. Then, the men reached the final page. The page was different. It was not a record of expenses. At the top of the page, Mrs. Lamont had written the heading, "Our Blessings." Beneath it, she had written 12 names in a single, neat column: Jacob, Samuel, Elias, Daniel, Peter, Caleb, Sarah, Leah, Rachel, Mary, Hannah, Esther. Beside each name, she had not written a date of birth or a place of origin. She had written the same 3 words, repeated 12 times, her elegant script as calm and steady as ever. Not born, not dead. The words sat on the page, a final chilling epitaph for a family that had defied all attempts at definition. They were not born into the world of records and laws. They had not died in the way the town understood death. They had simply been, and then they had ceased to be. This ledger was the only record they left behind, the only testament to their impossible existence. The Lamont farmhouse stood empty for years, a silent monument to the mystery that had briefly inhabited it. No one in Harmony Creek was brave enough to purchase the land. The blight in the surrounding fields receded the following spring, and the harvests returned to their former bounty. The town slowly healed, the sharp edge of its terror dulling into the stuff of folklore, a story to frighten children on dark winter nights. But the memory never truly faded. The disappearance of the Lamonts was as inexplicable as their arrival. They left no bodies, no graves, no answers. They left only a profound and unsettling silence. Local lore, the kind of story that is carried on the wind and whispered over fences, persists to this day. Travelers on the back roads that wind through the deep woods of that part of Maine sometimes report a strange sighting at dusk. They speak of seeing a group of children walking in a silent, orderly line along the edge of the forest. There are always 12 of them. Their faces are pale, their features identical. They do not speak. They do not look at the cars that slow down to watch them. They simply walk, a silent procession moving through the twilight, their destination unknown. They never seem to get any older, and they are never, ever fewer than 12. The case file on the Lamont family of Harmony Creek is now closed. Thank you for walking these halls of history with us. If you are new here, subscribe to stand among those who will be present when the next case is opened, and leave a comment to share your thoughts on what you have witnessed.